Going on, my friends? This is Goroth, Slave of the Empire. This is it's more source book than module, but it's a game module. Okay? So it says, by Nigel D. Findley. 4,000 years ago, Goroth was a beautiful trade world, caught between two warring factions that covered it and coveted its resources. Gorotin was too difficult to Gorotin was too difficult to occupy, yet too valuable to remain free. Solution was destruction. After the Scouring, Goroth was forever changed into a wasteland. Now the native Gorothites are beginning to rebuild their civilization. The horrors of the past have come to haunt the present. Yet again, the world is caught between two warring factions, the Empire and the Rebel Alliance. Yet again, the world is too valuable to remain free. Rich deposits of hyperbarides have brought the galaxy's megacorporations. Will Goroth suffer the same fate a second time? Right. So let's take a look at this thing. This was produced in 1995 by West End Games. This will be a first edition, first run version, blah, blah, blah. Get our introduction, our planetary stats, seeds, and information, overall map, history of the planet, the Republic era, Goroth at war. So basically, 4,000 years in the past, the natives of the planet went to war with each other and it was pretty brutal and involved a lot of nasty things. There was some bombardment, a catastrophe. It says here, nobody really knows which side cracked first, or rather both decided to settle matters about the same time. The logic led to the catastrophic is conduit, however, independent of which side reached the fatal conclusion first. It's cold reality, interplanetary economics has sealed Goroth's fate. Neither the Qualish Baronial nor the Carillion colonies could afford to annex Goroth. Conversely, neither could afford to leave the world to be utilized by the enemy. Someone decided Goroth had to be eliminated. So a bombardment was taking place and the place blasted back into the Stone Age. So we got the aftermath, reconstruction. It's right here. Surprising any Goroth survived at all. Initial consequences of endothermic killers dissipated within weeks. The seismic renaissances of the strikes continue to cease to ring through the crust of the planet. The worst of secondary strikes, chunks of planetary crust thrown up in suborbit or unstable orbital trajectories fell back to the surface, subsided. The survivors began to emerge from their various shelters. The tectonic stability of the crust had been badly upset. Once dormant volcanoes burst back to life. Lava, mud, and pyroclastic flows scoured the land to the bedrock in many places, wiping away all life. Millions of tons of matter were flung in the atmosphere. Water and rock already injected into the atmosphere by initial impacts, etc., etc. So it's a testament of the native population that they actually were able to survive this thing. The Imperial era, planet fall, force recovery, corporate sphere. This time, the third factor in the equation, the megacorporations must have called them off to admit he could not exploit Goroth properly because he simply did not have the available resources. Megacorporations, on the other hand, certainly do. So, first off, the primary materials, hyperbarides, and what they, I guess that's used in fuel. It talks about it here somewhere when we're across it. There's also a lot of other heavy metals and other material that, because of what the planet was put through, have come closer to the surface and make it a little easier to get to, which makes this place very valuable. Resistant movement amongst the locals. Chapter 2, the system overview. Planets, Goroth Prime. Goroth has 3 natural satellites. A couple other planets in the system. Traveler advisory. Says here, Vesta Nebula and the Pulsar at its heart are not the only hazards to navigation in this region. Since the Scouring has been somewhat hazardous to approach Goroth's system at all, this is because the asteroid impacts flung megatons of hyperbaride-rich debris into space. Much has fallen back to the planet, either secondary strikes as hard rain, while significant amounts remain in orbit at Goroth's Prime's tenuous ring. Countless tons, however, remain in Goroth's system space, forming a halo of hyperbaride-rich material. Concentration of material in real space can be measured in molecules per cubic meter of space. So just getting to the planet can be a bit of a challenge. The real halo thus represents a very real hazard to hyperspace navigation. Brave and foolhardy must decide to save a little time by flying closer to the Goroth prime before dropping into real space. Doing so represents a very risk of being ionized. Geography and geology. Population approaches nearly 500,000, or 500 million, excuse me. Under the auspices of the colonial government, official census is underway. Geology. Goroth has several seas, all of them small and very shallow. Total water coverage only 12% of the surface. Planetary crust varies in thickness from a few hundred meters in the highly active areas to a kilometer or two. Tectonic plates and continual drift, volcanism and seismic activity in the Badlands. Let's just say that everybody that's non-native to the planet needs to wear a face mask, a rebreather. World in torment, geography, mountains, volcanic badlands, storm season. Polar caps, the climate. The ring. Small static discharges in the ring are an almost constant event. Any given hour, there are probably a dozen or more small discharges somewhere in the ring. They are small enough to be harmless, even if their appearance is spectacular. On average, a major bolt will occur somewhere in the ring every 10 days or so. Also, on average, with any given spot in the equator of the planet will be flooded with an electromagnetic pulse once every 1.5 local years or so. It's important to note that the Albeki of Jirib in the eastern atmosphere is close enough to the equator to suffer from periodic electromagnetic pulse discharges. That's enough of your problems, right? So the atmosphere of Goroth Prime is contaminated with a wide range of potentially toxic compounds. Most of these are particulates, in other words, dust particles composed of hyperbaride compounds and other materials. Around active volcanoes, however, the air contains poisonous gases as well. In the wilderness, near the town. It says here, the atmosphere is class type 2. In other words, simple air breath filters are sufficient for off-worlders in type 2 areas. Only the poisonous components of the atmosphere are particulates that can be easily filtered out. Breath mask range in pricey 50 credits to over 500 credits. Only major difference between that the more expensive models typically last longer between filter replacements. Oceans and spring, polar caps, rain, radiation. Hyperbaride contamination is enough of a problem, but it's not the only one. The mantle of Goroth Prime is rich in more familiar radioactives, and the hammer blows of the crust have spread many radioisotopes across the surface of the planet. Level of beta and gamma radiation on the surface and the atmosphere is not enough to cause short-term damage to off-worlders. Long-term exposure on the order of years or decades is another story. Repulsor lift operation is also dodgy on this planet, and droids are also subject to having multiple breakdowns and other issues if they don't have additional radiation shielding attached. Communications can be affected. The natural resources are, of course, represent the reason why the Empire and now the Rebel Alliance have turned their attention to Goroth Prime. Goroth is a source for strategic heavy metals such as iridium, platinum, and osmium. It's the hyperbarides that make the planet so valuable. For many scientists have known that super heavy hyperbarides are more stable as more common elements, but possess certain chemical and physical properties that make them unique. So hyperbarides came to be used in many high-energy applications because they could withstand higher temperatures, flux densities, and levels of radiation as standard materials. Because of these quantity, hyperbarides are an important part of the high-yield turbolasers used by the Empire in its heavy capital ships and ground installations. Without a steady supply of hyperbarides, the Imperial weapons manufacturers will have to rely on inferior materials. So there you go. Chapter 5, the Gorothites themselves, biology, anatomy, nutrition, reproduction, maturity, aging, physiology, society, family relationships, the present day, religion, her involvement, special personality, Let's see. These guys are pretty. Let's see if we can find that spot, because these aliens are psychology. Goroths are natural survivors. Otherwise, they would have died out soon after scouring. They're mentally resilient, where they are emotionally sensitive, as cynical as other species. Certainly suffer fear and despair. They are undaunted by these emotions. Once the Gorothite has decided the goal is worth attaining, she will soldier on toward that goal regardless of the obstacles in her way. Greatest sin in their mind is giving up or setting aside a task when going gets difficult. Phrases like "when the going gets tough, the tough get going" are untranslatable to the Goroth tongue, merely because they are completely axiomatic, thus unquestionable. They have a somewhat unlayered. This is here. It's a strange undercurrent in the species psychology that sociologists have labeled fatalism. Not quite accurate, perhaps, but belief in predestination is closer to the mark. But it is also very difficult to describe this worldview. Hope is an alien concept in Gorothites. If the task is worth performing, if the goal is worthy, then a Gorothite will set about himself completing the task, regardless of the obstacles. Right? So these people can be pretty hard to deal with. On that. Species personality, humor, friendships, motivations, politics, local councils, economy, the black market, culture, present situation. You get the imperial involvement in the form of imperial government or a colonial government, the executive branch that likes to dole out a lot of the grunt stuff to corporations. Administrative branch, military present in orbit. There's a Star Destroyer that's more or less packed here all the time, and it's because the captain cheesed off somebody somewhere else, and this became their assigned, more or less permanent assignment. Make what you will of that. Planet-side laws, curfew, weapons, public meetings, armor, treason. Keep in mind, this is an occupied world in many aspects, and a corporate-dominated world in other aspects, which means the local citizen or a ship are under a number of laws and rules and conventions. We get the slave trade, the underground. Recent activity, history, organization, the People's Freedom Action Council, and a different faction, the rightful vengeance of other faction, right? We have the Rebel Alliance and their goals, and the lieutenant guy that's in charge of the Alliance cell on the planet. 7 major settlements. So we talk about common elements, pressures, motivators, people movers. Now we got to break down the city of Goroth, prime locations, and cities, and other things. A little bit of a map going on there. Getting in and out of the planet. And we got a typical hyperbaride extraction cracking facility. Individual facilities vary quite wildly depending on their exact functions and the nature of their environment. Specifically, topography and the proximity to the surface of the rich hyperbaride deposits. The following is information of a typical facility. So in the corporate aspect, a lot of the work's done by offloaders, and they're paid quite well, but they're more or less stuck in these facilities through rotations, which makes them a bit disgruntled no matter how well you're paid. And then they, of course, they hire a lot of the locals to do additional grunt work, so there's other issues. And we got some additional new technology, mostly antigrav and helicopter-based craft, in part because repulsor technology does not fare well in the atmosphere with all the radioactives and other things that are present. Like I said, including the droids, all have quirks and problems, and extreme layers of additional maintenance are required. So the fact is, it's tough. And if it's tough in the cities, it's far worse in the wilderness, which is why there's extra stuff here for you to want to deal with if your group is going outside the city. So there you have it. Goroth, Slave of the Empire. Really a decent one. I ran one campaign and included a stop here, and it was interesting.